This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello there and welcome to Global Business Africa. We'll be giving you insight into Africa's business and financial markets. I'm Uche Okworonkwo coming to you from Kenya's capital, Nairobi. Let's start with a look at the markets. Now, market optimism over a partial US-China trade deal faded today, driving markets into bearish territory. European equities were also lower as we saw the EU and Britain resume those talks in Brussels in order to avert a disorderly Brexit. On the continent, South Africa's JSE was subdued today. We saw the rand breaking through that 15 rand per dollar level for the first time this week, and that, of course, weighed on banks and financials. Both indices were down about 1% on the day. Now, also coming up on the show, South Africa's cash-strapped power utility Eskom plans nationwide power cuts. Kenyan president flags off the second phase of the Chinese-built standard gauge railway. And the IMF cuts its growth forecast over ongoing trade battles. Well, let's kick off today's show in South Africa, where state-owned electricity provider Eskom has begun implementing new power cuts amidst maintenance problems. Now, the firm is set to cut up to 2,000 megawatts of power from the national grid, and that's due to a shortage of generating capacity. Eskom is currently drowning in over $30 billion of debt. The utility is reliant on state bailouts as it plans to meet demand for electricity. Now, upon the power cut announcement, the rand tumbled more than 1% today. Power shortages have been a major constraint on output in Africa's most industrialized economy. This is expected to cost South Africa its last investment-grade credit rating from Moody's, which is due to deliver its next assessment on November 1st. Well, Angelo Coppola joins us in Johannesburg now with the latest on these rolling blackouts. Angelo, great to have you on the show. Now, this, of course, will be the first load shedding that South Africa has seen in more than 6 months. Eskom has alluded to its plant performance falling below expectations. So how, Angelo, how long is this expected to last? And is this a signal that the firm is unable to meet demand and that its capacity is now worsening?
Well, look, Uche, we're being led to believe that this current round of 4 hours rotating national blackout will continue for the rest of the week at least. It also now appears that there are 3 other generating units in the 15 units or in the 15 power stations around the country that are under threat, which could actually change that projection slightly. 6 units, as you know, went offline on Sunday and Monday, and that forced the hydro and gas stroke diesel plants to go into action, which of course then led to a diesel supply being depleted. This was completely unexpected, and it points to a precarious position that the utility finds itself in. It's the culmination, of course, of years of neglect and lack of maintenance, all of which has been compounded by an aging power fleet. So it's not going to change anytime soon, and we may possibly see some more rolling blackouts. We, of course, have another 3 hours worth of blackouts between now and 11 o'clock local time, Chair.
Well, Angelo, this announcement from Eskom came on the same day that Cabinet was deliberating on their integrated resource plan, which is basically the government's long-term strategy to meet electricity demand in the country. What was the outcome of that meeting?
Well, look, we don't know yet whether, in fact, that IRP, that integrated resource plan, was discussed today or not. Also on the table, we understand, was the shortlisted CEO list. There are 3 people on that list, and we believe that they're all men, and that there's that much vaunted turnaround plan that we've also all been waiting for close to a year now, in fact, more than a year. We will get clarity tomorrow when we expect to have feedback from the Cabinet meetings. It's a session that happens every week, the day after the Cabinet. It's commonplace, but tomorrow's session will be of particular interest, and that's to business people, those analysts out there, and investors. It's also likely that the ratings agencies will also be paying special attention. This, as we enter that final stretch before the medium-term budget policy statement, which happens at the end of the month. And of course, in November, as you've said, Moody's are due to pronounce on the country's ratings, which is only one notch above junk status. So we are entering a really turbulent phase at the moment, and it could be touch and go as to whether we get downgraded or not. It kind of depends on what happens with this rolling blackout session we're going through at the moment, Uche.
Well, Angelo, meanwhile, Eskom is challenging a recent decision by the National Energy Regulator. They decided to award it lower annual tariff increases than requested. So how big of a threat will this decision be to its financial position? And certainly, isn't Eskom expecting a bailout in that upcoming medium-term budget policy statement that you mentioned?
Well, look, it's definitely a big threat. In fact, part of what's irritated Eskom management and the board is that NERSA included the latest bailout figure as part of its calculation when it decided to cut that tariff request that Eskom had made initially. And that changes the state-owned entities' finances. The lower tariff, of course, is seen by many analysts as just one pillar of three to get the SOE back on track again. Other issues that need to be addressed include reducing that headcount at Eskom by 30% and inviting the private sector in to take some of that generation capacity on board. And of course, in terms of that mini budget that's coming up in less than 2 weeks' time, there's some expectation that there will be an additional amount of funds given to Eskom to dig itself out of that self-imposed hole. But that commitment will obviously come with some onerous clauses and checks and balances. And just to put everything into perspective, an analyst did some calculations on the back of a matchbox earlier, and he suggests that the stage 2 load shedding that we went through today costs the economy around $140 million a day. So it's not good news for the economy that's already under pressure, Uche.
All right. Well, many thanks, Angelo, for that update. Angelo Coppola joining us there in Johannesburg. Well, let's move on to Zimbabwe now. The government has launched a 4-year mineral strategy, which is aimed at generating about $12 billion by 2023. Now, Zimbabwe is richly endowed with mineral deposits from gold to diamonds. However, the Southern African nation has failed to put those resources to good use, and that's due to inconsistent policies. Here's CGTN's Farai Makutea with the details.
Zimbabwe's government says earnings from its 4 main metals, gold, platinum, chrome and diamonds, can reach $8 billion over the next 4 years, and along with exploitation of other minerals, help the country achieve a 344% quantum leap in revenue.
It could happen. We've got 40 different minerals in this country. We're only mining about half a dozen of them at the moment, but there's many, many more that we could. We're hoping to see the development of lithium mines, difficulties coming up there because of licensing problems and raising the funding, and all of that because of the uncertainties on electricity.
A severe power deficit has hit mines, lowering production and foreign currency receipts, and may scuttle the desired growth. However, soon-to-be-developed natural and coal-bed methane gas projects could lift performance.
The very interesting thing with that subsector is how the development of the minerals there are married to energy development. They're actually going to develop concurrently. So it means that it will actually solve the energy problem.
Industry stakeholders are upbeat about meeting the targets, but say a record of poor implementation needs to be rectified.
Having a roadmap on paper and having it actualized on the ground, they are two different things. So there are certain things that we need to do to make sure that these revenue targets are achieved. I will put them in 3 categories. The first one is policy and regulatory framework. The second one is competitiveness. And the last one, which is very key, is stability.
Several mineral policies are still outstanding or inconsistent. For instance, the indigenization law, which was repealed in the diamond and platinum sectors, verbally is yet to be amended in the statute books. It's those sort of uncertainties and concerns over tax regimes, foreign currency retention and repatriation that could hinder investment and that need to be quickly ironed out if this sector is to achieve its bold growth ambitions. Farai Mwakutuya, CGTN, Harare, Zimbabwe.
Well, let's stay in the mining sector. In recent years, Nigeria's mining industry has witnessed some phenomenal developments. The sector, however, remains untapped to a large extent and still needs a lot of progress in order to develop. Now, what exactly are the specific solutions available in order to boost Nigeria's mining sector? Well, CGTN's Kelechi Mekalam posed that question to the director of the Africa Finance Corporation.
When you look at a mining project in Africa, you have to look at it holistically. How do all the key stakeholders across the entire value chain work together to ensure that there is the project is successful? That is what we are trying to do, to find a way where we can invest across the entire value chain in the upstream, in the mine itself, invest in the transport infrastructure, the ports, as well as the beneficiation, which is the understated part in Africa. Most of our products are exported, and so there's no retention of value on the continent. So bridging that entire value chain is certainly an important aspect that needs to be considered when investing in projects across Africa.
Nigeria and Africa has a massive infrastructure gap. What's responsible for this?
We realize that government alone cannot fund infrastructure projects. And we've tried for a long time to have the government bear the burden. But you need to bring in the private sector to also come in and provide some assistance in terms of concessions that are bankable, and also collaborate with the government. We understand that they have a key role in terms of providing a regulatory environment for it to work, but you need to bring the private sector capital, and the mix of both of them will help to improve the bankability of infrastructure projects across Africa.
And how is the AFC accelerating the development in Africa?
To date, we've invested over $4.5 billion across Africa, from Cape Verde all the way to Cape Town, across 5 main sectors: power infrastructure, natural resources, so that's oil and gas and mining, transport infrastructure, heavy industries, telecommunications as well. You know, we are one of the highest rated entity in Africa, right? So, so we have after the Africa Development Bank. So that allows us to be able to access capital, third-party capital easily, and we believe that that also helps to catalyze and bring additional capital into the continent. The fact that we can raise money, it's a key attribute. So that's what AFC is focused on. The balance sheet currently sits around $5 billion, and we are optimistic that there are enough projects in Africa to be able to double our balance sheet size within the next 5 years to about $10 billion. So we are taking a very aggressive, expansionary view on that. I think that we obviously are cautious. We are optimistic that there are enough projects, but we just have to make sure that we have the right risk management framework. But the fact that we are an African-based entity, we are funded by African governments, it behooves us to be able to take that extra step and make sure that projects are bankable and that and they are successful.
What role would you say countries like China have played in the development of Africa?
And I think we need to work in collaboration with the Chinese and work in collaboration with the Europeans. They all have different funding mechanisms and funding models. I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all method. China does have an important role to play. Europe has an important role to play. The Americans have an important place to play, but most importantly, the Africans have the most important role to play. If we do not get our house in order, others will not come in. So we have to understand that we need the regulatory environment and have enough fiscal incentives to allow institutions or countries like China to see Africa as an investable destination.
And now look at some of our corporate headlines today. Airtel Kenya subscribers woke up to a major network outage on Wednesday. That's after the company developed a technical hitch in its service. Now, those who tried to access either their voice, data and SMS services were unable to do so. The telco, however, has confirmed in a tweet that it was aware of the disruption and has restored a network. Now, staying in Kenya, the country's KCB group has been ranked at position 717th in the top 1,000 World Bank ranking for 2019. The lender emerged 21st in Africa and number one in Eastern Africa out of close to 2,000 financial institutions who were analyzed based on last year's full financial results. Now, KCB's latest improved ranking has been attributed to its strong capital base, which is well within both internal and regulatory limits. Meanwhile, the Afro Champions Initiative has proposed a $1 trillion investment framework to support the goals of the African Continental Free Trade Area by 2030. The initiative is led by former South African President Thabo Mbeki and businessman Aliko Dangote. It is set to secure the funds in the next 10 years as it seeks to mobilize the African private sector and beyond. And finally, streaming giant Netflix is expected to release its third quarter earnings on Wednesday after the closing bell. This, of course, will be the firm's last report before the launch of several new streaming services from companies like Disney and Apple. Netflix has lost more than 20% of its value since its second quarter earnings release, which of course showed that the first U.S. subscriber decline has begun since 2011. And that's a look at our corporate headlines. Well, let's head into a quick break now, still to come. Kenyan president flags off the second phase of the Chinese-built standard gauge railway. And trade unions in Nigeria call off a planned countrywide strike.
The world economy as we know it is about to change. Global business reports highlight emerging markets, developing countries, and dynamic sectors worldwide. We feature top analysts and newsmakers to provide perspectives on every facet of business. From an on-the-ground perspective, we provide you with balanced and objective assessments. Fast, sharp, and insightful. Global business, only on CGTN.
Africa is the nexus of enterprise, and global business will tell you why it matters.
From the mega investment projects to multi-billion-dollar mergers and acquisitions.
Africa today collects, just in terms of revenues from taxes alone, $545 billion a year. If you take 10% of that and you devote it to the energy sector, problem solved.
All this on Global Business, weekdays at this time on CGTN.
Economic data out of the country. The country's foreign currency reserves.
With a dedicated and diverse team of anchors, CGTN now brings Africa to the palm of your hand.
I'm Penina Karibe in the heart of Nairobi, which is bustling.
From everyday heroes to the continent's most powerful figures, we bring their voices to you.
We haven't changed. And this is something most of us are very excited about.
We bring you news that's changing perspectives.
I'm Uche Okworonkwo reporting from Nairobi's city center.
News that brings Africa to the world. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back. Well, in Kenya, the second phase of the standard gauge railway has been commissioned by the country's president, Uhuru Kenyatta. The railway line is part of a project that connects the coastal city of Mombasa to Kisumu near Lake Victoria and into Uganda. Well, CGTN's Terry Wangari took the train from Nairobi and filed this report.
The Nairobi-Naivasha SGR is approximately 120 kilometers long and cuts along Nairobi, Ngong, Kajiado, Nakuru, and Narok counties. The passenger train will stop at 5 stations. These are Ongata Rongai, Ngong, Nachu, Mai Mahiu, and Suswa in Naivasha. The project also features 3 tunnels, including a 4.5-kilometer-long tunnel, making it the longest tunnel in East and Central Africa. The railway line is expected to ease congestion at the Nairobi-Naivasha highway, as well as boost regional trade and the local economy. The SGR project was launched together with the Nairobi Express Highway and the Naivasha Inland Container Depot. Together, these projects will facilitate the movement of goods and people from Mombasa to Naivasha with ease.
Commencement of operations, therefore, of the Makadara Express from Nairobi to Suswa will address the congestion of roads in the Embakasi and the ICD area, which has led to severe traffic congestion, increased vehicle operating costs, and increased accident rates. Such congestion has been a hindrance to trade and economic growth. It is for this reason that the government embarked on the development of the Nairobi Expressway.
So I am fully convinced that with the new SGR, ICD, and Expressway, Kenya friends will travel, study, work, and do business even more conveniently.
China Communications and Construction Company builds the second phase of the railway at a cost of $1.44 billion. The construction of the SGR, which now connects the coastal city of Mombasa to Naivasha, is part of China's Belt and Road Initiative, which seeks to connect continents through one transportation network. A Nairobi-Suswa ticket will cost as little as $2 for an economy seat. The journey between Nairobi and Naivasha is on average 2.5 hours by road. But with a steady speed of 116 kilometers per hour, this train cuts the time by half, making it easier for commuters to access the capital. Official data showed that SGR generated sales of around $55 million last year on the back of the cargo business. The passenger business generated sales of nearly $15 million, underlining the power of the cargo business in driving sales. With the opening of the second phase of the railway, this figure is expected to rise. Terry Wangari, CGTN, Mai Mahiu, Kenya.
Now, even as the country celebrated the launch at one of the towns along the line, locals had even more reason to celebrate. Residents of Kajiado County, which is located on the outskirts of Kenya's capital, are now beneficiaries of a water project which is linked to the railway line. As Wilkista Nyabo reports, the water was discovered during the drilling of the train tunnel.
On its first journey from the capital to the little center that is Kimuka, the train brought with it good tidings. On his way to launch Phase 2A of Kenya's standard gauge railway project, President Uhuru Kenyatta stopped at the little center to commission the Kimuka Oloishoibor water supply project, a project that is closely linked to the standard gauge railway. Technicians who were working on the railway rejoiced when they struck water.
We found this water when we were drilling the tunnel from Gong to this part of Kajiado West, and we decided to use the water to help the residents of this area.
And so the water project was born.
Everywhere the railway line goes, it brings about change. Here in Ngong, one of those changes lies in this water project, a development that will change the lives of residents here for the better.
It has been a blessing to us because we have been starving for a long time. We have been fetching water from dams, and we have been sharing water with animals, monkeys. So it has been a long starvation.
From the hills, the water flows down into a water pan. Already the China Communications Construction Company, the national government and the Kajiado County government have partnered to connect pipes for a distance of up to 23 kilometers. At least 10,000 people are expected to benefit initially.
We are so happy to have this water. Before we used to fetch water from far away, but now it is close to us. It will help us carry out irrigation and in many other ways.
And eventually, more will taste the sweetness of change.
We want the water to go all the way to the Iwaso, and the President has promised to give further directions to aid this project.
This, leaders believe, is only a taste of the development that the railway will bring to the area. Wilkisanyabo, CGTN.
Well, let's move on now. The East African Venture Capital Association has launched an investment guide to enable regional pension schemes to invest in private equity funds. Now, the scheme aims to deepen the understanding of private equity structures amongst pension fund managers and, of course, their trustees. The information will unlock more investment into the asset class. This development was informed by a market study that revealed a low uptake of investment by pension schemes. In Kenya, private equity allocations account for only 0.08% of the total industry assets under management. According to Kenya's pension regulator, the Retirement Benefits Authority, most pension schemes are still predominantly bond and stock investors. Well, Eva Warigia is the Executive Director of the East African Private Equity and Venture Capital Association. She joins us now live in the studio tonight. Great to have you on the show, Eva. Well, let's start off by asking this. What explains that risk aversion that we've seen by local pension funds to putting cash into asset classes such as private equity and, of course, venture capital?
Great. I'll start by saying it's not necessarily risk aversion. Right. We're seeing the asset is less than 20 years old in the market. So part of it is that this is a rather nascent industry to invest in. Beyond that, we have the fact that it's rather foreign. So unlike public equities or bonds that they've invested over long periods of time, this is an asset they've only been exposed to pretty much in the last 10 years. 3 years if you account for the fact that the regulation only came on board in 2016. And then the final bit is that at least for Kenya, the trustees own the liability of their investments, which means they are held responsible for any investment they make on behalf of their schemes. So in that sense, they may be a bit averse to taking up things that or assets that they consider rather new and untested.
All right. Well, are there any material differences in the level of risk aversion between public and private pension funds? Do they broadly act in the same manner?
They broadly act in the same manner. I'd say the only difference is that public schemes tend to be bigger because the workforce and the contributing workforce is largely significantly larger than the private sector. Of course, we have a few private companies like Safaricom, Kenya Airways that have a huge workforce. So because the public funds are bigger than the private sector funds, they tend to have a bigger mandate or a wider allocation mandate, which means they can test out newer assets. So they broadly have the same level of confidence in new or developing assets. It's just that for public funds, they have a wider pool from which to tap for their portfolio expansion.
Mm-hmm. Now this trend, it's common across Africa, but here in East Africa, recently we saw the sector regulator, that's the RBA, it changed investment rules actually back in 2016, and basically it allowed pension funds to invest a maximum of 10% of assets under management into private equity and venture capital. Since then, what has changed?
Since then, what's changed is when they did that, we had only about 3 pension funds that were invested in private equity. Per our last count, which is December last year, 2018, we had about 23 that were looking at private equity, 15 of which had made commitments on paper that they were going to be investing in private equity funds. So we've seen a growth in the appetite of pension funds to take up the asset class. Having said that, the numbers are still very minimal. In 2016, we were at 0.0126% of assets invested in the asset class. We're now at 0.08, so you could say there's some traction, but it's not enough. Yes.
Well, unfortunately, we have to leave it there. Great discussion. But thank you so much for joining us in the studio and for your insights. Of course, that's Eva Warigia. She's the Executive Director of the East African Private Equity and Venture Capital Association. Well, let's shift our focus now to Nigeria. The country's labor union has suspended a planned nationwide strike that was to commence on Wednesday. Representatives from labor unions and the federal government had been meeting over the implementation of the new minimum wage. The union says they're willing to continue with those negotiations. Here's CGTN's Kelechi Emekalam with more.
A string of meetings underway to resolve a lingering minimum wage dispute between government and labor union. It's all in a bid to avert a nationwide strike, one that's capable of crippling the economy. Labor wanted a 29% salary increase for workers between grade levels 7 and 14 and a 24% adjustment for levels 15 to 17. The union then reduced it to 25 and 20% for the different grade levels. But government is still at 17 and 15%, and both parties have been negotiating to reach a consensus.
The labor side has discovered that there's just one side on the welfare of workers, so we've worked very well together today. Both sides have made a lot of concessions, but we discovered that there are some gray areas that need to be ironed out. So some documents and information are being sought, which we are providing. And by the grace of God, tomorrow discussions will continue.
The negotiations have seen Labour shifting grounds on their proposed strike action scheduled for Wednesday.
Even though we thought the meeting will be concluded today, but that prediction was not successful, and therefore adjournment became necessary. To the best of our knowledge, the struggle we say continue applies. So far, commitment has been shown, but we believe that the areas that are still in contest are critical.
President Muhammadu Buhari approved the new minimum wage of $83 since April, but it's yet to be implemented. Workers are generally hopeful that the resolutions will considerably impact on their pay. Kelechi Emekalam, CGTN Abuja, Nigeria.
Well, here in Kenya, the China-Africa Mobile Economy Summit attracted top-notch global and local tech heavyweights. They basically were sharing insights on how today's businesses can capitalize on the unprecedented opportunities in this connected world today. Well, CGTN's Daniel Plafker was there and has those details.
A meeting of the minds. Over 100 tech companies talking shop in the heart of Kenya's Silicon Savannah.
The China-Africa Mobile Internet Economy Summit in Nairobi is bringing together some of the leading players on the continent's tech scene. Representatives from government and the private sector are coming together here to discuss the trends and innovations that are making the region's digital economy tick.
The two-day event spans workshops, panels, and showcases, covering everything from financial feats to Afro beats, all delivered via Africa's fast-growing mobile networks.
This is what we call virtual fiber.
For some, entertainment topped the agenda.
So it's a mobile app that allows users to create, share, and explore videos which are cool and fun. It's also a social community that connects video creators and their fans. It's the only short video app focused on Africa in the whole world. We come from Africa. More than half of our local staff, they come from Africa, and they play a very important role in the team.
The importance of a local touch was a common theme among attendees.
We always believed that localized products should be marketed by the localized team. So that's why Techno have been more emphasizing on the local employees. So over 90% of our employees are actually local employees.
Whether it's agriculture, entertainment, or personal finance, the digitization of the African economy has become a trend that's impossible to ignore. And while challenges do remain, attendees here are optimistic, determined to make the most of the opportunities. Daniel Plafker in Nairobi for CGTN.
Well, let's get more on the future of the mobile economy between China and Africa. We're joined by tech commentator and legal analyst Alexandria Williams. She joins us now in the studio. Great to have you, Alexandria. Well, let's start off with the fact that China's massive mobile market, it has 4G as the dominant mobile technology right now. 5G, of course, prospects are coming up every day, quite fast. Africa, on the other hand, has just seen 3G become the leading mobile tech this year in 2019. So where do you think China can help Africa sort of leapfrog when it comes to technology?
So interestingly, in the past, China has collaborated with Africa in the construction of Kenya's undersea cable that runs from the port of Mombasa all the way to the United Arab Emirates. And a lot of people in the tech space here in East Africa see the construction of that sea cable that led to connectivity for millions of people as the jumping off point for a lot of tech companies here. And then I think in the future, you'll see a lot of Chinese tech companies coming here to help bridge the gap between data and people by reducing the amount of data that people have to use. Africa is home to some of the highest data costs in the world, and Chinese tech companies in China are very good at creating software and hardware that allows people to reduce the amount of data that they use when they're on the internet. And we've seen how a Chinese company like Opera Mini is already doing that here, where they have this new in-app feature that allows people to transfer data and information without the use of 4G or Wi-Fi.
And you're quite right. Africa seems to be becoming a key player for Chinese tech companies and tech players. For example, Tecno, it sells more phones on the continent than it does than Samsung or Apple in Africa. Viskit is pretty interesting because it's become pretty popular in Nigeria, and it came to Africa, formed in Africa, had an Africa plan. So give us a sense, could Africa-focused tech become the future for Chinese developers going forward?
I absolutely think so. I was talking to an investor from China, and he said, if you came to China 30 years ago and you didn't understand what's going on, you've missed it. And I think a lot of Chinese investors, when they come to Africa, they see a similar story in what's going on here. 30 years ago, people did not think that A, China could develop its own native tech industry, and B, that tech industry could be profitable. And what China did have that people there were able to see is that they had high human capital, they had high literacy rates, and they had a high population. A lot of Chinese investors are seeing the same thing here, and they're ready to go and ready to invest.
All right. Now, many experts say that Africa's future, it will be shaped by technological advancement and, of course, innovation.
Yes.
Interesting question is, do you think China's advanced tech or local African innovation is going to drive that?
I think it will have to be a combination of the two. So I think in the past, a lot of Chinese tech companies would come here, do a period of research, and then start their own thing, much like Tecno did. But what a lot of people are doing now is they're combining with local tech companies, and they're saying, look, the industry is moving so fast here that we don't have time for market research. We must collaborate.
Well, thank you so much for that interesting discussion. Thank you for joining us in the studio today. That was Alexandria Williams. She's a tech commentator. Well, let's move on now. Family-owned businesses around the world are struggling to plan properly for succession, with barely 40% of them ready to deal with it in the next decade. Now, that's one of the findings of a survey of nearly 800 family-owned enterprises around the world, including 4 countries in Africa. Firms were more confident in their ability to respond to challenges in terms of ownership, governance, and strategy, but only 26% had a clear succession plan for the CEO position. An even smaller proportion had a clear succession plan for other C-suite posts. Now, of course, a lack of clear structures partially explains this trend, with only 44% of those firms surveyed saying they had a family constitution where group decisions on strategy, succession planning, as well as risk management were dealt with. Now, even though 7 out of every 10 of those respondents indicated that they expect to keep the business within the family, if financial considerations came into the picture, over a third were willing to trade control of the enterprise for greater financial success. Well, CGTN's Ramanyang explored why succession planning is still a huge problem for family-owned enterprises with Deloitte East Africa CEO Joe Eshu. Take a look.
I think that the typical family-owned business will be a business where currently you see a demographic of probably an aging executive. It's a business where you will find a lot of concentration on maybe on strategy, ownership, and concentration on what needs to be done for the future. And that's what 50% of our executives that we polled responded to. One thing that for sure is consistent across is that below 40% have actually taken care of issues of succession. So I think that what is consistent across Africa is that succession is still a big issue in family-owned businesses.
Is that something that you noted across all 4 countries in Africa? And how does it compare between, say, the 4 countries in Africa and the other markets that the survey was conducted in?
So it will surprise you that this is not an African issue. It is an issue across Europe, Americas, and Asia.
One of the things that did stand out for me, though, was the fact that there's this lack of formalization of a succession plan. But these are the same enterprises elsewhere in the survey who say we're thinking ahead, 3 years ahead, 4 years ahead, in how our business will survive. We're thinking 3 or 4 years ahead in terms of how we can better serve our clients, what the emerging tech threats are. And I find this interesting contradiction between the fact that they can be able to deal with those threats, the question of agility of the business. But when it comes to succession, thinking about who's going to be running this 5, 6 years down the line, no one's actually paying attention to that. Why? What explains that?
So yes, I think a lot of private businesses will say we are thinking ahead, which is true, but you can pick and choose where you focus on when you're thinking ahead. So you're thinking ahead about the product for the future. You're thinking about the ownership structure. But I guess it could be cultural, it could be the sentiment around giving up ownership of what you've created, the values which served as a foundation of the creation of that business, and the fear that nobody else can run the business like the way you do.
Because this is not just a purely rational thing, it's very emotional.
It is an emotional one. And that's why some of the recommendations is around that you've got to start the process of thinking about succession sooner rather than later. Because if you're thinking about succession when you're in your 60s and 70s, you don't have the energy to deal with it.
One of the other things that I guess that train of thought of value alignment comes through in is on the question of ownership, because only about a third of the companies who surveyed said we're willing to sell part of the business in order to ensure long-term success. And this comes up over and over again when it comes to looking for outside capital. It seems family-owned enterprises are very, very wary of cashing out. Why? Why hasn't that changed?
I think that is the biggest surprise, because a lot of family-run businesses have a strong vision for the organizations, right? So if you have a strong vision for the organization, I will assume that you'll be interested in ensuring the continuity of that vision by bringing in capital from other sources. But the survey results, I think, was a surprise that only a third are willing to trade their independence or give up some control to get capital to ensure their long-term view. I guess with some of the changes happening in our world, I'm hoping that this maybe in our next survey, this will be changing. But I also expect and suspect that it's also because of what family-run businesses perceive as the stringent reporting requirement of a PE company.
Because it does seem like a culture clash.
It's a cultural clash.
Right.
They come in, they're going to really change the way we do business. They're going to demand from us certain reporting requirements. But again, it goes back. If you find there's some organizations who can invest in your business and will pay attention to the values that you have. So you've got to look out for the possibility of having some alignment in the vision and the values of the organization.
You're watching Global Business Africa. Let's head into a quick break now, but still coming up on the show. The IMF cuts its growth forecast over ongoing trade battles. And refugees in Britain get coding skills to fill in a shortfall for experts.
How will your world change today? What happens here? What happens there? Or what you make happen for yourself? If it matters to you, it matters to us too. Your stories are these stories that need to be told. Africa Live. Find your voice.
Now, the International Monetary Fund has warned that trade battles are putting the global economy in a precarious position. The organization is reducing economic growth forecasts for almost all major economies. It is also concerned that its call for coordinated action in the event things get worse may be difficult in the current political climate. Well, CGTN's Owen Fairclough tells us more.
A stark warning from the International Monetary Fund's chief economist.
The global economy is in a synchronized slowdown, and we are once again downgrading growth for 2019 to 3%. Its slowest pace since the global financial crisis.
Just 12 months ago, the IMF was touting what it called steady growth, but trade wars waged by the Trump administration with partners including China have taken their toll and backfired on the US. The IMF sees US economic output falling by 0.5% next year, while China's would fall 2%, though some economists think China's prospects are much better due to reforms.
Policymakers must undo the trade barriers put in place with durable agreements, rein in geopolitical tensions, and reduce domestic policy uncertainty.
Those trade barriers may start to fall after the US and China last week verbally agreed a partial deal to resolve their trade battle. This would improve growth prospects everywhere for the IMF if that deal is signed off. But if conditions worsen, the IMF says an international coordinated response would be required, the kind of stimulus measures taken by global leaders in the wake of that financial disaster in 2008. And yet the Trump administration's America First strategy is being copied by other populist leaders around the world, and they're less interested in consensus than their predecessors. Owen Fairclough, CGTN, Washington.
Meanwhile, Hong Kong's chief executive, Carrie Lam, has given her latest policy address. The speech came after months of protests. It had been highly anticipated, as of course the public watches how the government plans to address the unrest. Here's CGTN's Zhao Yunfei reporting.
Carrie Lam's third policy address came amid months-long protests over the already withdrawn fugitive bill, but also people's concern over better livelihoods in Hong Kong. The remarks were pre-recorded after the chief executive was interrupted twice by opposition lawmakers Wednesday morning when she tried to deliver the speech.
Many sectors of our society have condemned the radical acts of rioters and supported the government to strictly enforce the law to end violence. Various sectors have appealed to people with different political views to put aside differences, stop violence as soon as possible, and restore calm in society.
This year's policy address is shorter due to a lack of preparation time, but Lam said she's providing an attachment to the report covering what the government has done and more promises. The speech heavily focused on housing and land supply policies. Lam proposed spending 5 billion Hong Kong dollars to provide 10,000 units of additional transitional housing in the next 3 years.
I hereby set a clear objective that every Hong Kong resident and his family will no longer have to be troubled by or preoccupied with housing issue, and that they will be able to have their own home in Hong Kong. a city that we share.
Financial services and tourism are two of Hong Kong's pillar industries. To maintain competitiveness, Lam has decided to promote social innovation, provide tax cuts for the maritime industry, and support export marketing. Lam says Hong Kong should take the advantage of the Belt and Road Initiative to invite cooperation between Hong Kong and mainland companies and seek opportunities from economic and trade zones overseas.
With our solid foundation, institutional strength, and the opportunities afforded by our motherland, as well as the perseverance and strong adaptability of Hong Kong people, I firmly believe that Hong Kong will be able to ride out this storm and move on.
Lam says Hong Kong's basic law protects human rights and the city should never tolerate any form of independence.
So long we have unwavering confidence, adhere to the one country, two systems principle, stop violence in accordance with the law, and restore social order as early as possible, Hong Kong will soon be able to emerge from the storm and embrace the rainbow.
The address carried the theme of Treasure Hong Kong, Our Home, and the SAR government says they want to show sincerity in making changes. Zhao Yunfei, CGTN, Hong Kong.
Well, let's move on now. More than a third of refugees in the UK are unemployed, but Britain has a huge shortage of skills in the IT sector, particularly when it comes to coders. According to one survey of Britain's bosses, 60% of companies can't find the right candidates for tech jobs, while CGTN's Jamie Owen has been to meet the founders of a charity called Code Your Future, which is helping refugees and asylum seekers program their way to a well-paid job.
For people like Benaz who arrive in the UK, it can be a struggle to navigate the bureaucracy of a new country, finding a new job and getting the right training. Many people feel isolated and find it hard to overcome the language barrier.
Most of the time they're not accepted because of their color, their language, their accent, maybe their costume. Everything is different from them. Although they try to fit in, but still you can see that, okay, they are not accepted.
Code Your Future was started by tech entrepreneurs who wanted to help people like Benaz access the job market. The charity's founders were moved by the stories of thousands of people fleeing Syria.
People were paying more attention to the immigration that was happening in Europe, and that raised a lot of media, and we were looking at that and we thought this is something that we can do something about. As technology people, we always try to solve problems.
Many refugees arrive in the UK with skills and experience, but often their qualifications are not recognised.
Most of them, the only job that they can have is just being a driver for Amazon or just delivery people. Although some of them, they had degrees from their countries. And some of them even they were programmers, but when they came here, they are not accepted.
Asylum seekers are simply not allowed to work in the UK until their case has been approved, which can take years. But training programs like this mean that when they are allowed to work, they enter the job market with much needed skills.
It's good to learn something, and who knows, when I'm allowed to work, at least I got a skill. I don't want to spend all day staying home thinking about how miserable I am. So this place gives me opportunities to have better future. I've learned a skill that I wouldn't learn in any other place.
As well as helping refugees and asylum seekers find jobs, the programme also helps plug a serious gap in the UK jobs market. There's a real shortage of skilled workers in the tech sector, a problem which the charity Techfugees is working to tackle.
The real issue is not about refugees being a drain onto society. It's about how can we think about refugees as becoming the new entrepreneurs, the new skilled people that we need in our society. There are 1 million jobs going in the UK right now for technology.
Refugees and asylum seekers have already had to overcome many obstacles before arriving in the UK. Charities like this go some way to offer a much-needed sense of belonging, as well as investing in people and their new country's future. Jamie Owen, CGTN, London.
Well, let's move on now. Here's a look at commodity prices today. We saw gold prices holding steady today after dropping nearly 1% in the previous session. Market participants are waiting for the outcome of that Brexit summit in Brussels this week. Meanwhile, oil prices slipping further below $59 a barrel. They were pressured by concerns about weaker demand for fuel, and that's due to slower economic growth and, of course, forecasts of a further rise in U.S. crude inventories. Well, we're heading into a quick break now. Here's a look at what's still to come. We introduce you to the online market for Made in Africa products. Now, Kenya's President Uhuru Kenyatta on Wednesday launched the Nairobi Expressway. That's the first of its kind in the country. The Phase 2A of the standard gauge railway will be a 4-lane dual carriageway that connects the Nairobi-Mombasa section and the Nairobi-Malaba section. The expressway has been sponsored by the China Road and Bridges Corporations. It will have 10 interchanges, including the SGR terminus at the country's Jomo Kenyatta International Airport. Now, the project is expected to be completed in December 2021. The railroad will be constructed at a cost of $599 million US. Let's move on now to two enterprising young African women who have started an online African emporium called VUCA. Now, you may ask, what's new about a digital marketplace? Well, everything that is traded on VUCA has to have a connection with the African continent. So either it's designed or made in Africa or imported by a local supplier. Here's CGTN's Julie Shire reporting.
VUCA is an online African marketplace started by a pair of female MBA students. African consumers often look for locally made products, but at times it can be hard to find.
We started to really look at the market and realize that there was no centralized location to get African brands or African products, which means that you would ideally have to depend on someone you know or somebody traveling, or you would have to visit that country on your own. So that's where the inception came, and we started to get a few stuff from Kenya and bring them here and sell them to people.
It wasn't long before the idea took off. In the last year, the online platform has signed up 20 suppliers, mostly in South Africa and Kenya.
We will sell anything as long as it's quality and it's made in Africa by Africans for Africa. But not necessarily for Africa, for the rest of the world, because you might think only Africans want to buy this thing, but there's a huge interest from countries like the USA, Australia, UK.
But dealing with multiple currencies and stringent border controls has brought some challenges in moving goods around the continent.
The way VUCA works is that we dispatch our products from a centralized location, which is in Johannesburg, to the world. And so we would need them to send their products to us. And then the second challenge around that is also export. But what happens is that the shipping costs end up being triple the actual product that they're ordering.
But the pair is optimistic that this will change with the push for increased intra-African trade.
We're hoping to be able to digitize as many African businesses as possible. That's the vision we see. We see ourselves as almost the thought leaders, the leaders of this industry, and also just imparting knowledge on African brands, on how do you create a brand and how do you take that brand and make it accessible to people beyond your borders.
Online shopping has cottoned on in South Africa, but it's still relatively small compared to other parts of the world. VUCA is hoping to capitalize on consumers who look for convenience at the click of a button. Julie Shire, CGTN, Johannesburg, South Africa.
Well, that's it for this edition of Global Business Africa. Remember, you can send your feedback to the contacts on your screen. You can also follow us on our various digital media platforms. From me, Uche Okworonkwo, and of course the rest of the team, thanks for watching.